Hi everyone, my name is Nina Ellis, Dr. Nina Ellis, and I teach English, creative writing and comparative literature here at a university in Egypt. This week's video is really for my freshman students and for freshman university students everywhere who are wondering how on earth to plan their first analytical English essay. I thought I'd talk through with you the way that I've taught my students to plan their first analytical English essay ahead of their midterms, so that they can also watch this video and make sure that they're on track before the exam comes around next week. So I think the first thing to understand about an English literature analytical essay is that you can break it down into components in quite a scientific way to make sure that you get the grade that you want. But at the same time, you need to combine that with your own personal instinct, argument, and opinion. So it's a combination of structure and personal flair. Now, let me get specific about how to do this. So I went a little bit crazy and I made this for all my students, which is a planning sheet where they can write down all the components that they plan to put into their analytical midterm essays next week. So you can see here that the columns are the different elements that go into each paragraph, and the rows are the different paragraphs. So I have 5 rows: the introduction, the first paragraph, the second paragraph, the third paragraph, and the conclusion. Whoops. And I have 4 rows. I have the argument, which is the opportunity for personal flair, opinion, a little bit of cool writing style that sounds a little bit like you while also being elevated and formal. Next, we have textual evidence, so quotes and naming the literary devices in these quotes. Next, we have context, so information around the social and historical background for the text that we're studying. And finally, we have other interpretations in the 4th column, which involves bringing in opinions from other critics and people who've written about the text that you're studying. So to fill in this sheet, what I would recommend is that you go down the first column, the argument column, first, figuring out what your argument is for each paragraph. In your introduction, you're going to write about the main argument for your essay. In my case, I've set my students an essay asking whether Allen Ginsberg is or is not a literary rebel. So in their introductions, they'll be stating a strong argument for why they do think he is a literary rebel, or why they don't, or why they think he's somewhere in between. Next, you move down to your second row, first column, which is your first paragraph. And here you're going to articulate the mini argument, the first of 3 mini arguments that proves your main argument, the one in your introduction, to be true. So, for example, you could say that Allen Ginsberg is a literary rebel, if that was your main argument, because he created a new and groundbreaking form of poetry that disregarded existing conventions of syntax and decided to be guided by breath instead. Then you move down to your third row, your second main body paragraph, not counting the introduction, and you find another mini argument. So, for example, you could say that Allen Ginsberg is a literary rebel because he wrote about taboo topics like homosexual love, which was controversial in 1950s America. Next, you move down to your 4th row, or third paragraph, and you articulate another mini argument to prove your point. And at the very end, we have a row for the conclusion. And in the conclusion, I've said, what have you convinced your examiner, me, of in this essay? Don't repeat yourself, use new words. So I don't want you to just sum up what you said in your introduction or over the course of your essay. I want you to take what you've argued and add a little bit of spice, a little bit of something new to it. And one way of doing that is by looking towards the future. So if you've argued that Allen Ginsberg is a literary rebel, you could explain that he started his own sort of rebellious poetic tradition to which other poets later conformed. So he was originally a rebel, but he led a rebellion that became a movement that other people could conform to. That's quite interesting as an argument. Next, I would recommend that you fill in the 3rd column, which is the context column. And here I've said for the introduction, what are 3 key pieces of information that your examiner, me, needs to know about the text before reading your essay. So this would be the date of publication, a little bit of information about the poet themselves or the writer themselves, and anything else that is essential when I'm coming to your essay, imagining that I've never read the text in question before. I don't even know what howl is. Then you go down and you do that for paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3, adding just 1 key piece of contextual information for each paragraph. So obviously, if you're arguing that Allen Ginsberg is a literary rebel, you could talk about the obscenity trial. And I've said for each paragraph, I only want 1 piece of context. And that's because, honestly, context can be a bit distracting from textual analysis. And that is normally what is being assessed in an essay analyzing a piece of literature. And I don't want to distract from that. Once you've filled in your little bits of context, I would then recommend that you go to column 2, which is the textual evidence column for quotes and why they prove each of your mini arguments to be true. So you don't need any quotes in your introduction. In your first paragraph, you go ahead and put in, I've suggested 3 quotes from the poem, for example, if you're writing about Hal, or from whatever text you're working on. And for each one, I've suggested that you name in your essay plan the literary device. You do this again for paragraphs 2 and 3. And in each case, it's really important that the textual evidence you select, so the quotes you select, do prove the mini argument of that paragraph to be true. So if your paragraph, for example, is arguing firstly that Allen Ginsberg created a new poetic form, a new way of writing, you would want to find 3 quotes that show that he's breaking with previous traditions of literary writing and poetry. Then I've suggested saving one nice juicy quote for the conclusion, where you can kind of encourage your reader or your examiner to look forward to other ways of analysing the text in hand. So bring in a final quote that proves your argument that you can kind of punch home with at the end of your essay. And then the last column I would ask you to fill in is the 4th column, the other interpretations column. Again, you don't need any other interpretations for your introduction, in my opinion. You just need them for the main body paragraphs of your essay. So I've said in paragraph 1, which is the second row, who might agree or disagree with this paragraph's mini argument and why. So you can do a bit of research, for example, on JSTOR, and I can do a future video about how to find good academic essays to draw from, if you like. You can do a bit of research and find some critics who agree or disagree with the mini argument for each paragraph. So in this case, say your first paragraph is about Allen Ginsberg creating a new poetic form. You can find people who agree with that, or even someone who disagrees with it. The danger there is that you might be undermining your argument, so you'd have to frame it in this way. You'd have to say, whereas some critics, for example, X, Y, or Z, have argued that Ginsberg was merely following in the footsteps of Whitman and other American lyric poets, he diverged in all the ways that I've demonstrated in this paragraph, and then you specify the ways without repeating yourself. And then you do that for the other 2 main body paragraphs, finding a different critic for paragraph 2 or row 3, and another critic for paragraph 3 or row 4. And you don't need any of that for your conclusion. And once you've done that, you've built a really good essay plan. And all of my freshman students, you should have done this by now. And when it comes to writing your essay, what you do is you then work your way across the document. So now you're going left to right. You begin with your introduction, you state your main argument. You don't need any quotes, that's the second box in the first row for your introduction. But you should put in those 3 pieces of key contextual information that I need to know going into marking your essay, grading your essay. And again, you don't really need any other interpretations for the introduction. At that point, you can break and go to the next row, which means the next paragraph. Here you find your first mini argument, which you can articulate really clearly to prove the main overarching argument. You then proceed to go to the second box, which is your various quotes, and you go ahead and analyze each quote, always looping it back to the mini argument of that paragraph and showing how the quotes prove that mini argument to be true. You bring in a little bit of context briefly without getting too distracted by context. And then finally, you talk about a critic who agrees or, in your opinion, incorrectly disagrees with the mini argument of that paragraph. Then you finish that row, so you get to move to the next paragraph. You start with your mini argument, you analyze 3 quotes in detail, talking about the literary devices that have been used there and how they prove your mini argument for that paragraph. You bring in a little bit of context without getting distracted, that's the third box. And finally, you talk about a critic who might agree, ideally, or incorrectly disagree with your argument for that paragraph. And then you do the same thing for the third paragraph. Finally, in your conclusion, you have your new way of articulating what you've been trying to say in your essay, followed by an interesting quote that you've saved up for the end to really drive home your point. And then, actually, I forgot to mention, it's really nice to end an essay by saying why the text you've been writing about is or is not relevant to our society today, and what it can tell us about the world that we are living, writing, and reading in. By working your way across the rows like this, you should be able to bring together a really coherent and persuasive essay. Now, of course, I don't want to be too formulaic, and as you get more confident in your writing, you might want to reorder the elements of your essay, but at the moment, in your freshman year, your first midterms, I would stick to that program, working your way down. I hope this is helpful, especially to my own students, and I'm wishing you lots of good luck in your midterms next week. In the meantime, please feel free to message me on Instagram or TikTok with any suggestions of things that you would like me to address in my videos. And you can also follow me on Substack, which is lookingforlucia.substack.com, or just check out my website, linaellis.com. Thank you so much, and see you next week.